Alright, section 4, refrigerant poisoning and cardiac sensitization. The very first study I found by simply Googling Freon and palpitations was a study from the Cairo University called Cardiotoxicity Due to Occupational Exposure to Freon. Objective is, the present study was designed to investigate cardiovascular manifestations among occupationally exposed workers to Freon and to assess environmental exposure during the maintenance step of air conditioners. Results. The studies revealed that there was statistically significant increase in diastolic blood pressure and heart rate in Freon-exposed group than in control. Chest pain and palpitation were observed more significantly among Freon-exposed workers when compared to control group. Conclusion. Unprotected occupational exposure to chlorofluorocarbons can induce cardiotoxicity in the form of cardiac arrhythmias or changes in the ECG. These changes can be prevented by pre-employment selection of unsusceptible workers and periodic monitoring of cardiovascular parameters indicative of toxicity as doing regular ECG. Right, keywords: Freon, cardiotoxicity, myocardial arrhythmias, and chlorofluorocarbons. Alright, that study was enough for me to quit my job after making the connection, and after filing the initial WCB claim, over time I've kept researching to understand exactly what had happened to me. But being a hypochondriac, during that time I was waiting to be properly medicated. I didn't do any kind of research. I was trying the best I could to convince myself that I would be okay. Alright, the next thing I want to show is safety data sheets, both from Pubchem, one for 134A and one for R12, both substances I was working with. Alright, on 134A, on page 5, synonyms, it has a list of all the different names for this chemical. 134A, page 29, section 12.7.2, other standards. Workplace environmental exposure level of an 8-hour time-weighted average is 1,000 parts per million. Effects of short-term exposure. The substance may cause effects on the central nervous system and cardiovascular system. This may result in cardiac disorders. Page 33. Toxicity summary. 134A in animal studies can induce cardiac sensitization in dogs at levels of 80,000 parts per million and higher following exogenous epinephrine challenge. Page 34. Antidote and emergency treatment. Monitor cardiac rhythm and treat arrhythmias if necessary. Page 36. Populations of special risk. In persons with impaired cardiovascular functions, especially those with a history of cardiac arrhythmias, the inhalation of refrigerant 114 might cause exacerbation of disorders of the conduction mechanism due to sensitizing effects on the myocardium. I don't know why they put Freon 114 here, but I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be 134A. Alright, the other chemical, R12, let's read the safety data sheet for that. Page 4, synonyms, Freon 12. Page 17, mechanism of action. Freons are toxic to humans by several mechanisms. Inhaled fluorocarbons sensitize the myocardium to catecholamines, frequently resulting in lethal ventricular arrhythmias. These compounds also have a central nervous system anesthetic effect analogous to structurally similar general aesthetic halothane. Page 23, OSHA standards. Permissible exposure limit, time-weighted average of 1,000 parts per million. Page 27, effects of short-term exposure. This substance may cause effects on the cardiovascular system and central nervous system. This may result in cardiac disorders and central nervous system depression. Page 33, symptoms and inhalation symptoms. Symptoms, cardiac arrhythmias. Inhalation symptoms, irregular heartbeat. Page 34, antidote and emergency treatment. Victims of Freon inhalation require management for hypoxic, CNS, aesthetic, and cardiac symptoms. A calm environment with no physical exertion is imperative to avoid increasing endogenous adrenic levels. Exogenous adrenic level drugs must not be used to avoid inducing sensitized myocardial dysrhythmias. Atropine is ineffective in treating bradyarrhythmias. For ventricular dysrhythmias, diaphragmatoin and countershock may be effective. Advanced treatments. Monitor cardiac rhythm and treat arrhythmias if necessary. Medical surveillance. Employees should be screened for history of certain medical conditions which might place the employee at increased risk from R12 exposure. cardiovascular disease in persons with impaired cardiovascular function, especially those with a history of cardiac arrhythmias, the inhalation of Freon 12 might cause exacerbation of disorders of the conduction mechanism due to its sensitizing effects on the myocardium. Any employee developing the above listed conditions should be referred for further medical examination. Cardiac sensitization seems to be the key words here. This allowed me to actually find the studies where they determined how much refrigerant in the air was possible. One of these studies was a study from 1975 called Environmental Hazard Assessment of 1 and 2 carbon fluorocarbons. Page 157, Cardiovascular Effects of Fluorocarbons, Cardiac Sensitization to Exogenous Epinephrine-Induced Arrhythmias. A variety of hydrocarbons with and without halogen substitution have long been known to sensitize the heart to epinephrine-induced arrhythmias, including ventricular fibrillation. Page 176. Cardiac sensitization to asphyxia-induced arrhythmia. Perhaps the greatest controversy concerning the toxicity of the fluorocarbon gases has been stimulated by the work of Taylor and Harris, which may indicate that these compounds on inhalation are toxic to the hearts of mice. This toxicity is evidenced in fluorocarbon-exposed mice by the rapid onset of sinus bradycardia and atrioventricular block, induced by a degree of partial asphyxia which caused tachycardia in mice not previously exposed to the fluorocarbons. These investigators have reproduced their original findings in over 200 mice using Freon 11, Freon 12, and Freon 114 from a variety of sources. The next document I want to show is a report by professional engineer James M. Combe that was done for the Air Conditioning and Refrigeration Technology Institute of Virginia, published in 2000, called Toxicity Data to Determine Refrigerant Concentration Limits. On page 3, the abstract. This report reviews toxicity data, identifies sources for them, and presents resulting exposure limits for refrigerants for consideration by qualified parties in developing safety guides, standards, codes, and regulations. It outlines a method to calculate an acute toxicity exposure limit, and from it a recommended refrigerant concentration limit for emergency exposures. The report focuses on acute toxicity with particular attention to lethality, cardiac sensitization, anesthetic, and central nervous system effects and other escape impairing effects. It addresses R12 and R134A. Page 1, Introduction. The data primarily addresses those pertinent to acute inhalation exposures from an emergency releases rather than chronic exposures. Acute toxicity refers to the adverse health effects of a short-term single exposure. Chronic toxicity refers to those from long-term or repeated exposures. Emergency signifies unplanned and unintended releases with a view towards mitigating risk for the general public. In contrast, occupational exposure limits assume that potentially affected personnel should be cognizant of the potential for exposures, has special awareness or training, and may employ protective measures or devices. Page 7, Exposure Concentration Limits. The principle from Paracelsus, dosis solo facit venenum, the dose alone makes the poison, is axiomatic to the objectives of this report. It suggests that exposures to refrigerants or other chemicals will not cause harm if kept to a safe level. The goal here is to determine that level as a concentration for a specified period of time for common refrigerants for the majority of people. It does not address exposure limits for people with rare conditions or taking special medications that may make them more sensitive or vulnerable. Many steps can be taken to isolate refrigerants to minimize the risk of human and exposures. The issue here is to quantify the concentration to which nearly all people can be exposed to without harm. More specifically, the focus is on emergency exposures, those that may occur in unanticipated circumstances such as piping ruptures in occupied spaces. The goal is to determine objectively the highest concentration that will not harm people while they escape or until their refrigerant is removed. Such limits differ from occupational exposure limits in which repeated exposure or potential exposures of worker are anticipated. Beyond using refrigerants with low toxicity, measures such as training, confinement, ventilation, special garments, or even self-contained breathing apparatus may offer protection as appropriate to the refrigerants, task, and locations involved for occupational needs. The next part I will read is page 8. effects. The method proposed concentrates on toxicity. Within toxicity, it focuses on cardiac sensitization. Cardiac sensitization refers to an acute effect in which the heart is rendered more sensitive to the body's own catamine compounds or administered drugs such as epinephrine, possibly resulting in a regular heartbeat that could be fatal. Catamines include adrenaline or adrenaline-like chemicals that consist of benzene rings with attached groups of nitrogen and halogen atoms, or nitrogen and halocarbon or hydrocarbon radicals. They function in the body as hormones, neurotransmitters, or both. The body's adrenal glands release them under conditions of stress or strong emotions such as fear or anger. The next part I'll show is page 140, safety data. The safety section is subdivided into classifications: recommended exposure limits, acute, short-term, single exposure, and chronic, long-term, repeated exposure toxicity data, flammability data, and detection. The exposure limits are further separated into short-term occupational, long-term occupational, and emergency exposures. Depending on the refrigerant, more than 100 parameters, some with differing values for species or exposure durations and toxicity tests are reported. The following brief summary addresses only the chronic toxicity and flammability indices used to determine standard refrigerant safety classifications. The first value is an occupational exposure limit, namely the threshold limit value, time-weighted average, or a consistent measure. It is an indication of chronic long-term repeat exposure toxicity of the refrigerant. Some of the consistent toxicity indices are the Workplace Environmental Exposure Level Guides and the Permissible Exposure Limit. These measures indicate adopted limits for workplace exposures for trained personnel for typical work days and work weeks. And then the other thing I want to show is an article written by the same author, James Combe, where he displays a table with the different refrigeration limits. Yeah, you can see 134A here. Chronic long-term occupational exposure limit is 1,000. It's the same thing for R12, 134A. So the most current and up-to-date study I could find about the cardiac effects of fluorocarbons was a document created in 2009 called Evaluation of Cardiac Sensitization Test Methods, Technical Report number 105. Page 1, Executive Summary. Cardiac sensitization means that the normal heart rhythm becomes perturbed, for example, when high concentrations of some halogenated or unsubstituted hydrocarbon vapors are inhaled for a short time in combination with the situations causing high internal adrenaline levels. The resulting cardiac arrhythmias may be fatal. Therefore, the cardiac sensitization potential of development fluorocarbon products need to be known before these products can be safely used. This report reviews how cardiac sensitization studies have been conducted and the way in which those test results are used in the prediction of human risk. Critical aspects of the test protocol are the selection of the dose of adrenaline used to challenge the heart and the definition of positive response. Risk assessment of cardiac sensitization is based on the extrapolation of the animal data to humans, but should also take account of individuals' susceptibility and health status and other factors such as medication. The current protocols appear to provide accurate, robust scientific information and are designed conservatively with built-in safety factors. Thus, no additional safety factors need to be applied in the risk assessment process. For improved risk assessment, human blood levels of the inhaled compounds can be estimated using biokinetic modeling techniques. This kind of modeling can also account for sensitive subpopulations. Little is known about the biological mechanism of the cardiac sensitizing effects of halogenated and unsubstituted hydrocarbons. The report reviews several aspects and possible contributing factors in detail. Compared to volatile anesthetics, which have an adverse impact on cardiac electrophysiology, cardiac sensitization seems to be a complex event that is not fully understood at present. There is no clear alternative test system for cardiac sensitization. The report discusses the utility of various possible alternatives to replace or refine the current adrenaline-treated dog model. The term cardiac sensitization is used to refer to the phenomenon where exposure to high concentrations of many halogenated and unsubstituted hydrocarbons may cause the heart to be transiently more sensitive than normal to the arrhythmogenic effects of endogenous catamines. This sensitization, coupled with elevated levels of circulating adrenaline, can result in the development of serious and sometimes fatal cardiac arrhythmias for a short period following exposure to sufficiently high concentrations of these compounds. An important consideration is the way in which the results of these studies are used in the prediction of human risk. The risk assessment process regarding cardiac sensitization should take into account the extrapolation of the animal data to humans, individual susceptibility, the health status of the individual, and other factors such as medication. It is argued that the normal practice of applying a safety factor to an observed no-effect concentration is not the most appropriate way to use the data from the protocols based on the dog model on the prediction of human risk. The current protocols appear to provide accurate, robust scientific information relative to the cardiac sensitization potential of chemicals of interest, and with the use of the PBK model are valid predictors of cardiac sensitization potential for use in human risk assessment. The protocols are designed conservatively with built-in safety factors, and thus no additional safety factors need to be applied in the risk assessment process. It is acknowledged that the current protocols might be further developed to improve their applicability and utility as risk assessment tools. Little is known about the underlying mechanisms of the cardiac sensitizing effects of halogenated and unsubstituted hydrocarbons. The report reviews a number of potential targets of effects, including receptor-mediated signal transduction, neurotransmitter reuptake, impact on sodium and calcium channels in cardiac muscle potassium, repolarization currents, and the potential impact on cardiac action potentials, conduction velocity, and intercellular coupling. The evidence from volatile anesthetics suggests an adverse impact on cardiac electrophysiology that may have relevance to the other halocarbons. It is concluded that cardiac sensitization is a complex event involving multiple possible mechanisms, and that the exact mechanism targeted by halocarbons is not fully understood at present. Cardiac sensitization is a toxicological endpoint that is frequently used to determine the human health risks associated with acute inhalation exposure to halogenated hydrocarbons and other chemicals with cardiac sensitization potential. Human cardiac sensitization risk assessment activities or determinations of safe exposure level are based fundamentally on two approaches. One approach is based on the direct application of the no-L and low-L exposure concentrations generated in cardiac sensitization studies. The other approach is based on the interaction between human biological processes and the chemical of interest. The latter approach is often referred to as the physiologically based pharmacokinetic modeling approach, or more descriptively, the physiologically based biokinetic model. Page 32, Human Considerations. Taking into account the major protocol parameters as outlined above, a reasonable assumption would be that the experimental design used by Reinhardt provides a rigorous screening test for determining the cardiac sensitization potential of a chemical. Human experience would bear this assumption out, since no deaths have been reported from exposure to chlorofluorocarbons or hydrofluorocarbons when exposure to recommended levels has been observed, further supporting evidence that recommended exposure levels do not pose a risk of cardiac arrhythmias comes from several studies involving human subjects. Summary. The risk assessment process regarding cardiac sensitization should take into account the extrapolation of the animal data to humans, individual susceptibility, the health status of the individual, and other factors such as medication. All right, page 46, conclusions. The adrenaline-treated dog is the current test system of choice. There are no clear alternatives to the adrenaline-treated dog. The test has evolved and been used successfully for almost 40 years. Safe exposure levels established using this test have been demonstrated to be protective of human cardiac sensitization. The test has demonstrated reproducible results. Interpretation of results should be done by experienced practitioners. Each animal serves as its own control, and a detailed evaluation of an ECG data is required. Every positive cardiac sensitization response is potentially fatal. A positive response resulting in death should not be interpreted as more severe than a positive response in which the animal recovers. Cardiac sensitization mechanisms may be complex and diverse. The precise mechanism involved in cardiac sensitization for a particular chemical may not be fully known. However, the test results are valid with or without an understanding of the mechanism involved in production of a positive response. I feel this is enough documentation and studies to prove that it's not a question of if exposure to Freon can cause a regular heartbeat. The question is how much is it going to take for an individual like me who was having heart palpitations before I even took the job. WCB can claim that I was exposed to relatively minimal Freon while also claiming the Freon cannot cause palpitations, aka irregular heartbeat. But without having ever done an air quality test, how do they know? Without an air quality test, I can't even guess to how much I was being exposed to because I just don't have the numbers to do the arithmetic. But I do believe it was enough to cause some kind of cardiac sensitization. And that's the end of this segment. Thank you.